You never truly know your neighbors until it's too late. For me, moving into a new apartment was supposed to be the start of something fresh and exciting. Little did I know one of my neighbors would turn my peaceful new life into an unnerving ordeal I'd never forget. Before I met and moved in with my current girlfriend, I had my fair share of bad luck with previous homes. One experience in particular still sends shivers down my spine. It was when I lived in a 3-story apartment complex. Each floor had 4 apartments, and we all shared a laundry room. My unit was on the 2nd floor, located at the end of a long hallway. The complex itself seemed fine, but I soon discovered my quiet new home harbored an unsettling presence. From the very first day, I noticed little quirks about the place. Upstairs, a couple communicated exclusively by screaming at each other. Their arguments never escalated further, but they were loud enough to remind me they were there. Meanwhile, someone else in the building cooked frequently, filling the halls with mouth-watering smells unless they overdid the onions, which happened more often than I'd like. However, none of these quirks could compare to the issue that eventually drove me out of that apartment, my neighbor, whom I'll call Todd. When I moved in, my brother and a few friends helped me with the heavy furniture. Todd stepped out of his apartment a couple of times, nodding or stepping aside as we passed with large items, but he didn't say much. On my final day of moving, I was alone, carrying smaller items into my car. That's when Todd appeared again, this time offering to help. Awkward with strangers, I hesitated but ultimately accepted. He introduced himself as we walked down the hall, and after I unlocked my door, I took the box he was carrying and thanked him. He pointed to his apartment and said, "If you need help with anything else, just let me know." I thanked him again, and he left. The first week in my new apartment passed uneventfully. I unpacked, organized, and kept to myself. Occasionally I ran into Todd. He'd say hello and attempt small talk, which I brushed off as neighborly friendliness. But as time went on, his presence became disturbingly consistent. No matter when I came or went, Todd seemed to be around. He'd appear at the building's entrance when I got home, hold the door open for me, and wish me a good evening. At first, I told myself it was coincidence, but soon it felt calculated. His timing was impeccable. On the rare occasions I had free time to go for a walk or run errands, Todd would suddenly emerge from his apartment, asking if I needed bananas or bread he claimed to have bought in excess. Even my favorite Friday night visits to Starbucks weren't safe. Todd would always show up, acting surprised to see me and striking up a conversation. It was unsettling. When I confided in a friend about Todd's behavior, she suggested he might be stalking me. I brushed off her concerns at first, thinking she was overreacting. Why would anyone stalk me? I was just an average young woman trying to juggle work and school. Still, her words lingered in the back of my mind. One Saturday night, my perception of Todd shifted completely. After dinner and drinks with friends, I arrived home around 1 a.m., tired and slightly tipsy. As I passed Todd's door, it opened. Ignoring his calls, I hurried into my apartment and locked the door. Moments later, he knocked. Reluctantly, I answered, hoping he'd leave quickly. "Late night, huh?" he said with a smile. I nodded, trying to signal that I wasn't in the mood to chat. "I was worried when you didn't come home at your usual time," he added. His comment made my blood run cold. How did he know my usual time? When I asked, Todd claimed he noticed my Saturday routine home by afternoon, rarely leaving again. My heart raced as I asked directly, "Todd, are you stalking me?" He bristled, becoming defensive. "I'm not stalking you. I'm just looking out for you. You're young, small, and living alone. Someone has to make sure you're safe. I told him I didn't need his protection and explained how his constant presence made me uncomfortable. His jaw tightened and his tone shifted. "You should be thanking me for what I do for you," he snapped. Then, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, he added, "In fact, you owe me." When he tried to step into my apartment, I screamed for him to leave. He pushed against the door, shouting, but I managed to force him back. Overwhelmed with fear and adrenaline, I threw up all over Todd. He recoiled in disgust, called me nasty, and stormed off. Shaking, I locked the door and called the police. A neighbor who had heard the commotion knocked on my door, saying she'd already called the cops. They arrived minutes later, but Todd refused to answer his door. I pressed charges the next day and immediately asked the property management to transfer me to another building. They took my concerns seriously and moved me to a new apartment within days. I stayed with a friend during the transition and made sure I always had someone with me while moving. Thankfully, I never saw Todd again. To this day, I'm grateful for the neighbor who called the police and checked on me. As for Todd, I hope our paths never cross again. Moving into a new home should be a fresh start, but sometimes the neighbors you inherit can turn your dream into a living nightmare. Little did I know my love for dogs and my new home would lead to one of the strangest and most unsettling experiences of my life. In 2021, I moved into a cozy 2-bedroom house with a full basement and an attached garage. It was perfect for me and my passion for fostering dogs. After leaving my previous rental due to disagreements with the owners about my dogs, I was excited to finally have a space where my furry companions could thrive. My plan was to renovate the garage into a haven for them, complete with beds, toys, and their own little safe space. Moving day was hectic but rewarding. With help from friends and coworkers, I managed to get everything into the house over a few days. On the last night, we worked late, powered by the promise of free beer and pizza. Around 2 a.m., as we sat in the living room, relaxing with controllers in hand, a knock at the door startled us. To my surprise, it was a police officer responding to a noise complaint. He understood our situation after seeing the moving boxes and assured us everything was fine, but reminded us to keep the noise down. The incident left me curious about who had called the cops, but I brushed it off and focused on settling in. Over the next few weeks, I noticed something odd about my new neighborhood. It started with subtle, watchful eyes. The elderly woman next door would collect her mail at the same time as me, but would scurry away if I approached. Once, I caught her pretending to inspect her trash bin, only to dart back inside when I made eye contact. Then, there were the children who stared at me from the street while riding their bikes, only to pedal away quickly when I waved. One Sunday, while mowing my lawn, I felt the unmistakable sensation of being watched. Looking around, I spotted 2 kids standing with their bikes, staring. Across the street, a woman on the phone pointed toward my house, animatedly gesturing, while a man with crossed arms glared at me. On another occasion, I noticed a neighbor on the other side peering over his fence into my yard. When I greeted him, he seemed startled and hurried back inside. The unsettling behavior continued, with people going out of their way to avoid me or rushing their kids indoors whenever I came home. Determined to understand what was going on, I decided to confront the situation. One day, while at a nearby coffee shop, I saw Neil, the only neighbor who had been remotely friendly. He waved and invited me to sit with him. After some small talk, I broached the subject of the neighborhood's peculiar behavior. Neil chuckled and said, "They're probably just afraid of you." His comment caught me off guard. I'm a larger guy with full tattoo sleeves and a bald head, but I've never considered myself intimidating. Neil explained that people in the area didn't take well to outsiders and likely let their imaginations run wild. Despite his reassurance, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to their behavior. A few days later, I took one of my dogs for a walk. As I passed Neil's house, he called me over. He was talking to Sarah, the woman from across the street, who stood next to a child clutching a fundraiser booklet. Neil introduced us, jokingly mentioning how I thought the neighbors didn't like me. Sarah's face turned red, and she quickly denied it, but Neil pressed on, asking about my work and lifestyle. I explained that I worked in security and often came home late because of my overnight shifts. I also shared my love for fostering dogs, noting that I frequently had visitors during the day for adoptions. Sarah's demeanor softened as she seemed to piece things together. She admitted that some of the neighbors found my late hours and the steady stream of visitors unusual. The sounds from my garage, where I bathed and cared for the dogs, likely added to their suspicions. The tension broke when the child asked if I wanted to support his school fundraiser. Unable to resist chocolate, I bought an entire box of candy bars, earning a big smile from him. The interaction seemed to ease Sarah's discomfort, and we parted on a friendlier note. That night, I reflected on the situation. While I initially felt hurt by the judgment, I realized how my actions might have appeared to others. My mom's words rang true. You were the mysterious neighbor they didn't understand. It made me laugh and helped me approach the situation with a new perspective. Since then, things have improved. The kids in the neighborhood often stop by to play with my dogs, and fundraisers have become a regular visit to my door. Even the elderly woman next door appreciates when I shovel her driveway or mow her lawn. While I may have started as the creepy neighbor in their eyes, I've become a part of the community, proving that sometimes understanding and patience can turn suspicion into friendship. What if the seemingly quiet family next door harbored secrets so dark they turned your idyllic neighborhood into a chilling nightmare? This is the story of how my peaceful life unraveled after the Simons moved in. 3 years ago, I moved to a quaint suburban neighborhood. It was the perfect place, with tree-lined streets and meticulously maintained lawns. Everyone knew each other by name, and the community radiated tranquility. That all changed the night the Simons arrived. Their moving truck rumbled into the neighborhood under the cover of darkness, an unusual sight in a community where everything seemed to happen in broad daylight. I watched from my window as shadowy figures moved furniture into the house without turning on a single light. Their silhouettes, lit only by the dim streetlights, struck me as strange, but I shrugged it off, assuming they were just night owls. The first unsettling incident occurred a few weeks later. While tending to my garden, I noticed Mrs. Simon standing at her window, staring blankly in my direction. Her unblinking eyes and expressionless face sent a shiver down my spine. I waved to her, hoping to break the tension, but she didn't respond. Instead, she stood there, watching me. Unnerved, I retreated inside, convincing myself that I was overthinking. Not long after, the noises began. At first, I thought I was imagining things, faint scraping sounds late at night, heavy thuds and low murmurs that seemed to emanate from the Simons' house. I wasn't the only one who noticed. One morning, while collecting mail, my neighbor, Mrs. Kowalski, mentioned the strange sounds. Have you heard those noises from the Simons' house? It's like they're dragging furniture around at all hours, she said, shaking her head. We laughed it off, but unease lingered. The situation escalated when pets began disappearing. First, it was the Johnsons' cat, Muffin. Then the crane's dog, Rex, vanished without a trace. The neighborhood buzzed with concern and suspicion. I kept a close eye on my own cat, Whiskers, making sure she stayed indoors. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that the Simons were involved. One evening, I saw Mr. Simon in his backyard digging. The yard was already dotted with several freshly dug holes. Curiosity and fear churned within me. What was he burying? I decided to confront him. As I approached, he stopped digging and turned to face me. "Good evening," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Good evening," he replied curtly, wiping his brow with a dirty sleeve. "What are you digging for?" I asked, attempting to sound casual. "Gardening. Planning to plant some new trees," he said flatly. His tone offered no room for further questions. I nodded, pretending to believe him, but my unease deepened. That night I barely slept, haunted by images of those holes and what might lie beneath them. A few days later, Whiskers went missing. I searched everywhere, calling her name until my throat was hoarse. Desperation drove me to a reckless decision. Under the cover of darkness, I sneaked into the Simons' backyard with a flashlight and a small spade. My heart pounded as I approached one of the holes. I began digging, adrenaline and fear making my hands tremble. After a few minutes, I unearthed a small, blood-stained collar. It was Whiskers. Before I could process the horror, a hand clamped down on my shoulder. I spun around to find Mr. Simon glaring at me. "Looking for something?" he asked, his voice cold and devoid of emotion. My mind raced for an excuse, but I stammered incoherently. His grip tightened, and he leaned in close. "Stay out of my yard," he growled. "Next time you won't be so lucky." Terrified, I flew back to my house, clutching Whiskers' collar to my chest. I locked every door and window, my mind a whirlwind of fear and grief. The next morning I called the police. They investigated but found no evidence of foul play. The Simons continued their unsettling existence, and I lived in constant fear, always watching my back. Months passed, and more pets disappeared. The neighborhood's once vibrant spirit faded, replaced by a collective dread that seemed to center on the Simons' house. Unable to bear the oppressive atmosphere any longer, I moved away. Even now, years later, I still dream of that night, the cold earth, the blood-stained collar, and Mr. Simon's unfeeling eyes. The darkness they brought into our neighborhood lingered long after I left, a chilling reminder that sometimes the most terrifying monsters are the ones who live next door. Imagine living alone in what seems like an ordinary neighborhood, only to realize someone is watching your every move, not just watching but actively trying to invade your life. This chilling story of stalking will make you rethink everything about privacy and safety. I'm a 28-year-old woman, and for most of my life I've been a magnet for stalkers and bullies. I think it's because I'm shy and tend to keep to myself, which seems to attract the wrong kind of attention. People often mistake my quiet nature for vulnerability, assuming I won't stand up for myself. This particular experience happened between November 2011 and mid-2013. It was a nightmare that still gives me chills. At the time, I lived alone in a small 2-bedroom house at the end of a street near a secluded field. The area wasn't the safest, but it wasn't terrible either. Somewhere in between. My family lived out of state, and I didn't have many friends around due to my busy schedule. Between work, errands, and taking classes, I was always on the go and generally preferred my solitude. I couldn't afford a car, so I walked everywhere to work, to the park for jogging, and to my evening art classes. To get to the main road, I had to pass by my neighbor's house. He lived about 4 houses down from me, and I noticed early on that he always seemed to be outside when I walked by. At first, I didn't think much of it. I assumed he was just another neighbor enjoying his yard. But then things started to feel off. I'm a creature of habit with a predictable routine. I woke up at 5:45 a.m. for a jog, worked from 6:30 a.m. to 4 p.m., and attended art classes at 5:30 p.m. Sometimes I'd go for another jog around 7:30 p.m. and be back home by 8:30 p.m. This routine made it easy for him to track my movements. It began with him watching me. Every time I walked by, he'd be on his lawn staring. When I reached my door, I'd turn around to see him walking back to his house, as if he'd been standing there just to observe me. Then came the small talk. "Hey, how are you?" he'd say. At first, I gave polite but brief responses. A nod, a mumbled good, and a quick wave. But his questions grew more personal over time. "You live alone, right? Where do you work? How come no one ever visits you?" I tried to stay evasive. "I work in town. I'm just really busy," I'd say with a nervous laugh, fumbling with my headphones to signal that the conversation was over. But he wasn't deterred. His persistence was unnerving. One day, I caught him snooping through my mail. I'd arrived home earlier than usual and saw him hastily shoving envelopes back into my mailbox. He didn't even seem embarrassed when I confronted him. He just smiled and walked away. Over the following months, his behavior escalated. He started blocking my path when I jogged, standing directly in my way until I acknowledged him. He'd make comments about how lonely I must be and how he could keep me company. Once, he even followed me to the park, staying just far enough behind that it felt like a coincidence, but I knew it wasn't. The breaking point came one evening when I returned from my art class. It was dark, and as I approached my house, I noticed a shadow moving near my bedroom window. My heart sank. I froze for a moment, unsure of what to do, before deciding to walk past my house as if I hadn't noticed. I called a friend from a nearby convenience store, asking them to come over and check things out with me. When we got back, the shadow was gone, but there were fresh footprints in the dirt beneath my window. My friend insisted I call the police, and I finally did. They took my report but said there wasn't much they could do without more evidence. I felt helpless. For the next few weeks, I stayed with a coworker while I arranged to move out. On my last night in that house, as I packed up my things, I heard a knock at the door. It was him. "You're leaving?" he asked, his voice cold and devoid of the fake friendliness he'd used before. "Yes," I said, trying to sound firm. "I'm moving." He stared at me for what felt like an eternity before finally saying, "You'll miss me." I didn't respond. I closed the door and locked it, waiting until I heard his footsteps retreat before exhaling. The next morning I left for good. To this day, I'm hyper-aware of my surroundings. I double-check all locks and never stick to a predictable routine. Living alone taught me to be independent, but it also taught me to trust my instincts. If something feels wrong, it probably is. And to anyone listening, stay alert. You never know who might be watching. When the past haunts the present, the truth is buried deeper than you think. What would you do if the neighbor you knew suddenly became a stranger in the dead of night? Did you hear that? I think someone is outside, my wife whispered as she shook me awake. I stirred, startled, and took a moment to comprehend what was happening. "Huh?" what I replied groggily. I heard footsteps near the window. "Someone is out there," she insisted, panic evident in her voice. "Are you sure?" "Darling, I'm certain. There is someone right outside." I sat up and prepared to get out of bed, but my wife grabbed my arm. "Don't get up and look," she pleaded in a hushed tone. "Call the police. It might be someone trying to get in." "I can't hear anything, Jenny. If someone were trying to break in, we'd hear more noise," I reasoned. "I'll go check. It might just be a possum or something." Cautiously, I approached the window, which was concealed by thick black curtains. I reached out, grasped the edge, and pulled the curtain aside. Moonlight spilled into the room, illuminating two eyes staring straight at me through the glass. I recoiled in alarm, my heart pounding. "What is it? Who's there?" Jenny called out from the bed. My mind raced with the possibility that someone was indeed attempting to break into the house. But as I studied the face, I realized I recognized it. It was Mr. Haynes, the old man who lived next door. "It's the neighbor, Mr. Haynes," I whispered back to Jenny. "What's he doing in our garden?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Hello, Mr. Haynes," I called through the window. "Are you all right?" Mr. Haynes didn't respond. He simply continued to stare, his face blank and his eyes glazed over. Wrinkles dominated his gaunt features, and his long, scraggly hair framed his thinning scalp. "Hello," I tried again, but he remained silent. "What do we do?" Jenny whispered. "Maybe he needs help," I suggested. When I turned back to the window, Mr. Haynes was gone, vanished. Mr. Haynes had always been a quiet neighbor. We rarely saw him except when he tended to his rose garden or waved goodbye to his daughter during her infrequent visits. This behavior was completely out of character. What should we do? I asked Jenny, glancing at the clock. It was 11:30 p.m. "Is he gone?" she asked. "I think so. I don't see him anymore," I said, scanning the yard. "Do you think he knows what he's doing?" "What do you mean?" "Well, he's getting old. Maybe he's not all there anymore," Jenny suggested. "Maybe," I replied, considering her words. His eyes didn't seem to recognize me earlier. We chalked up his strange behavior to old age. Deciding to stay awake for a while just in case he returned, we left the curtain open. At some point, though, I must have dozed off. The next thing I remember was Jenny shaking me awake. "Is that him?" she asked, pointing out into the garden. I sat up and squinted into the darkness. Near the back fence, two faint pinpricks of light reflected the moonlight eyes. As the figure stepped forward, the shadows peeled away, revealing Mr. Haynes. "I'm scared, honey," Jenny whispered, gripping my hand. "It's okay, darling, it's just Mr. Haynes again." Mr. Haynes approached the window, raised his hands, and pressed them against the glass. He leaned in, peering through the pane. "Excuse me," I called from the bed. His eyes flicked to meet mine, but he didn't reply. This time his face was smeared with dirt. Slowly he removed his hand, leaned forward, and exhaled onto the glass, fogging it up. Jenny and I exchanged uneasy glances. When we turned back, we saw him drawing something in the fog. a crude rose. Then Mr. Haynes raised his arm, pointed at us, then at the ground before scampering off into the night. "We should call the police," Jenny said, breaking the tense silence. I agreed. The police promised to check on Mr. Haynes but said it could take hours. Exhausted, Jenny and I eventually drifted off. I was jolted awake again by Jenny's scream. "He's here, in the room," she whimpered, pale and shaking. At the foot of the bed stood Mr. Haynes, staring at us. His gaunt frame and dirt-covered figure were unmistakable. "What the hell are you doing in our house?" I shouted, trying to sound intimidating. Mr. Haynes stood silently before his mouth opened, releasing a raspy voice I didn't recognize. "Mr. Haynes isn't here anymore," he croaked. "And you will lay next to him." Jenny and I froze in terror. Before we could react, he retreated into the shadows of the room and disappeared. We called the police again, and when they arrived, we recounted everything. They left to check on Mr. Haynes. By morning, his daughter arrived in tears. "Thank you for calling the police," she said. "Otherwise, it might have been a while before we found him." "Where did you find him?" I asked. "One in the garden," she replied, sobbing. "Under the rose bed. The police estimate he died between midnight and 2 a.m. The chilling part? They found 2 other graves beside his. Jenny and I stood there, paralyzed as the realization washed over us like a freezing tide. The air in the room seemed to thicken, and the faint scent of roses lingered, a scent I hadn't noticed before. "What does that mean?" Jenny stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't have an answer. My mind raced, trying to piece together the horror of the night with the grim revelation from the morning. Mr. Haynes had been dead while his figure, his presence haunted us. And the other graves, who were they for? Had anyone else in the neighborhood ever noticed something odd about him? Or was this the first time he'd reached beyond his resting place? Jenny grabbed my arm, pulling me back to reality. "We can't stay here," she said, her voice trembling. "We have to go." I nodded, but as we turned to pack a few things, the unmistakable sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway outside our bedroom, slow, deliberate, and coming closer. We froze. The bedroom door creaked open, and there, standing in the doorway, was Mr. Haynes, or whatever was left of him. His hollow eyes locked onto us, his lips curling into a ghastly smile. "They'll make room for you," he rasped. The last thing I remember was his dirt-streaked hand reaching for us as the scent of roses grew suffocatingly strong. They say you never truly know your neighbors until something forces you to look deeper. For my wife and me, moving to Maple Street revealed secrets darker than we ever imagined, secrets hidden behind warm smiles and perfectly trimmed hedges. It all began shortly after my wife and I moved into our new home on Maple Street. We had finally saved enough money for a down payment on a small bungalow in Hampstead, our quaint hometown. The first few days were a whirlwind of unpacking and settling in, and we were both excited to start this new chapter. One afternoon, as we were sorting boxes, there was a knock at the front door. Opening it, we were greeted by a cheerful couple holding a casserole dish. They introduced themselves as Sarah and Greg, our next-door neighbors, and welcomed us warmly to the neighborhood. "Wow, that's so kind of you," I said, taking the dish from Sarah. I'm George, and this is my wife, Christine, I added. It's great to meet you, Greg said with a smile. If you need anything at all, just let us know. A cup of sugar, some tools, whatever you need, we're here to help. Their friendliness was refreshing, and after a brief chat, they headed back home, leaving us to settle in. 2 weeks later, I found myself taking them up on their offer. I was assembling a table, but couldn't locate my tools amid the chaos of moving. Hoping they could help, I walked over to their house and knocked on the door. Greg answered, his usual warm smile on his face. Of course. Come on in, he said, waving me inside. Let's grab what you need from the garage. As he opened the garage door, I was struck by how immaculately organized it was. Every tool had its place, with labeled drawers and cabinets lining the walls. There were rows of hammers, saws, and axes hanging in perfect order, each spotless and gleaming. Even the table saw looked pristine, its blade shining as if it had never been used. Wow, Greg, this is impressive, I said, admiring the setup. Thanks, he replied. I'm an engineer, and well, we're an odd breed. I like things to be precise. He handed me a screwdriver, and I thanked him before heading back home. Something about his garage stuck with me, though. It was almost too perfect, and I found myself wondering why someone would maintain tools so meticulously yet rarely use them. Over the next few weeks, Greg and Sarah continued to be model neighbors, always waving hello and making small talk. However, my wife and I couldn't help but notice oddities about them. Greg, for instance, often worked in his garage late at night. The soft hum of the table saw, or the occasional clinking of tools would drift over to our house, though we never saw any projects or creations emerge. Then, one evening, things took a strange turn. My wife and I were having dinner when there was an abrupt knock at the door. Opening it, we found Greg standing there, looking unusually nervous. Hey, George, he began, his voice shaky. I need your help with something in the garage. Confused but curious, I followed him over. As we entered the garage, the usual spotless interior was in slight disarray. A large tarp was draped over something bulky in the corner. What's going on, Greg? I asked, glancing at the tarp. He hesitated, his hands fidgeting. I need help moving this, he said, gesturing toward the covered object. I stepped closer, but as I did, a metallic smell hit me. My stomach churned. Before I could ask questions, Greg whipped the tarp off, revealing a large, blood-stained freezer chest. My breath caught in my throat. What the hell, Greg? I exclaimed, stepping back. It's not what it looks like, he stammered. Please just help me. I can't do this alone. Do what? I demanded. My heart was pounding, and I felt a sudden urge to get out of there. Greg's demeanor shifted. His eyes hardened, and his friendly facade melted away. You've seen too much now, George. You're either with me or against me. Fear rooted me in place as the realization of my predicament sunk in. I glanced toward the garage door, calculating my chances of escape. Meanwhile, Greg reached for something on the workbench, a hammer. You don't have to do this, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I don't want to, he replied coldly, but I can't risk you telling anyone. The next few moments were a blur. Summoning every ounce of courage, I lunged for the garage door and threw it open. I bolted out, yelling for my wife to call the police. Greg didn't chase me. Instead, he stood in the doorway, watching silently as I ran. His calmness was more terrifying than if he'd tried to stop me. The police arrived within minutes. I explained everything, and they quickly detained Greg. A search of his property revealed horrors beyond anything I could have imagined. The freezer held human remains, later identified as missing persons from nearby towns. Sarah, too, was arrested, her involvement undeniable. Our little dream home on Maple Street had turned into a nightmare. We moved out shortly after, unable to shake the memories of what had happened. To this day, I wonder how many other neighbors hide secrets behind their perfect smiles. What would you do if the person you least expected became the source of your worst nightmare? Let me tell you a chilling story of a seemingly harmless man who turned a quiet neighborhood's sense of safety into a memory of fear. This happened to a friend of mine, Emily, who lived just a few houses down from me when we were about 8 or 9 years old. Our neighborhood was the kind where everyone knew each other. It was so safe that people often left their doors unlocked without a second thought. The biggest worry we ever had was an outsider causing trouble. Across the street from Emily's house lived an incredibly nice family, a mom, a dad, a 16-year-old son, and their 22-year-old son, Tim, who was mentally challenged. Tim was always home because his disability prevented him from working. While his parents worked full-time and his brother was at school, Tim spent most of his days outside, waving and smiling at anyone passing by. His huge, toothy grins and occasional giggles weren't creepy to us. If anything, they were endearing, a simple joy radiating from someone who spent so much time alone. One day, Emily stayed home sick from school. Even though she was only about 8, her mom let her stay alone because she'd be home by 2 p.m., and the neighborhood was so safe. All the doors were locked, except the one leading from the garage into the house. This was their usual entrance, as it was easier to pull into the garage and walk in that way. The garage door was left cracked slightly open for their cat to come and go, as it needed access to food and shelter. Emily was resting in her parents' bedroom when she woke up to loud pounding on the front door. Startled, she went downstairs and looked through the peephole. It was Tim. She cracked the door open, and he told her he noticed she was home alone and offered to guard her house. Emily thanked him but politely declined, saying she didn't need any help. Tim's expression darkened. He snapped. "You think I can't do it because I'm dumb? Watch and see I ain't dumb." Frightened, Emily apologized, said she didn't mean it like that, and excused herself to rest. She went back upstairs and dozed off, but woke up again to noises coming from the kitchen, the room connected to the garage. Disoriented, she glanced at the clock, 10:20 a.m., much too early for her mom to be home. She hadn't heard the garage door open, but her fever-clouded mind assumed she must have missed it. The noises grew louder. Realizing something was wrong, Emily panicked and ran to her parents' bathroom, slamming the door shut only to remember it didn't have a lock. The noise alerted the intruder, and she heard heavy footsteps coming upstairs. Thinking quickly, she slipped into her parents' closet and hid behind some clothes. Peeking through the slats, Emily's heart sank. Tim entered the bedroom, tall and thin, clutching a knife. She held her breath, doing everything she could not to scream. He searched the room, muttering angrily and making loud, guttural noises of frustration. He checked the bathroom, paced around, then eventually left. Emily stayed hidden in the closet for hours, trembling, until she finally heard her mom come home. When she emerged, she was hysterical and recounted everything. Her mom, initially skeptical, found a kitchen knife near the front door and immediately called the police. An official report was filed, but Emily never spoke about the incident again. Her parents spoke to mine occasionally about what happened, but I never heard the details of any consequences for Tim. The ordeal left Emily traumatized. She started therapy and carried the fear with her for years. When we later moved in together for college, her habits reflected her lasting unease. She locked every door and window, even installing an extra lock on her bedroom door. She checked them all 3 times before bed, and she refused to discuss Tim or that day. As terrifying as the experience was, it served as a wake-up call for our community. From that day on, no one left their doors unlocked. It was a sobering reminder that safety can never be taken for granted.